And that's
Yes.
also the destroyed summer palace, the
Yeah,
Yuan
you were
Ming.
asking me how it looked like today. That's how it looked like today.
Good God.
Okay. Other than that, the rest of the park is just the park with trees, grass, and some
Yeah,
lakes. Yeah.
yeah,
The only
yeah,
thing left of the building is what is
yeah.
showing there. Yeah.
How is Beijing? How are
Well,
things?
I'm not in Beijing. I mean, in Wuhan, which is in Hubei province. So it's a
Right.
central China. It's a little bit like Chicago to
Yeah.
yeah. So it's
Oh,
kind of
wow.
central. The people here are telling me that Wuhan is very close to everywhere.
Right. Okay.
So
Gosh.
it's center of yeah. So
Wow.
everything
Okay. Gosh.
yeah, everything's good. Very interesting trip. We visited a museum. During those spring and the winter, I mean autumn period, warrior period,
Mm-hmm.
one of the seven kingdom is the Hmong, and that kingdom is based here. So there's a lot of those stuff.
Oh, I see. Oh,
Yeah,
I see. Interesting. Yeah.
yeah. So
That's,
yeah,
well.
one of the things they had is the very rare sword in that museum that they discovered that made like 2,000 years ago, but to this day is still very
Mm,
sharp. So
yeah.
there was some pretty high tech stuff even back then. So
Oh, absolutely. I don't know. Again, I don't know whether you've ever heard of him. There was a British academic called Joseph Needham. I know about him because he was an academic at Catherine's College in
okay,
Cambridge, which is
yeah,
still her
I think I
college, by
heard
the
him.
way.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Anyway, he did a monumental encyclopedia about
Hmm.
Chinese science, which is still it's an extraordinary work, a work of a tremendous erudition. But I mean, he pointed out that China was centuries, not centuries, thousands of years ahead of the Western metallurgy. And the result was that they were able to produce these incredibly sharp swords and things and that's how the Shang dynasty did its bronzes. The technology to do that did not exist in the West at that time.
Yeah.
And he pointed out also, that if the Roman army had ever marched to China and come up against Qin Shi Huang's army,
Hmm.
the Chinese army was so much more technologically sophisticated at that time. They were
Hmm.
completely obliterated them. I mean, their cross bows and their metal weapons were of such more advanced at that time
Yeah.
that it would have been no contest.
Hmm. The kingdom is called the Chu, Chu, one of the seven kingdom. Yeah.
Oh, that's one of the very big ones, isn't it? One of the
Yes.
very
Yeah.
important ones. The ones that
Yes.
I think it was the last one to be captured by Qin
one
Shi
of the
Huang.
one of the
Yeah,
last I think the last one is Qi,
yeah.
but Qi they
Xi.
didn't take much effort. They basically
Yeah,
surrendered, but
yeah.
Chu was
That's
the
right.
one who among the last. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
the and you
Without
know the
doubt.
Dragon Boat Festival, that was
Yeah.
to memorize one of the Chu's high official, Qu Yuan, who is a poem. And he
Ah.
was so disappointed with his leader at the time, the emperor, because he made so much mistakes. And so
Mm.
he saw his country just to become quickly, decimated, and he was so devastated. So he jumped into the river and killed himself.
Oh.
And for the people, they are trying to protect his body, so they throw in some small food, packet of food, so the fish won't eat his body. They will eat the small the food that that people drop in. That's how the Dragon Boat Festival started. So people eat those
Good,
粽子. That
good
that was the
grief. Okay.
yeah. And it's just
Well,
I think last week or last the weekend that was the Dragon Boat Festival. So
do Chinese people, are they at all aware of a series of extraordinary novels that were written in the 60s by a Dutch diplomat, which involve an official of the Ming dynasty, no, of the Tang dynasty called
uh-huh.
Judge D. Judge D.
No.
No, no. I mean, they're based
Yes.
apparently. Well, yes,
A
but I mean,
detective, right?
detective. That's right.
Yeah, okay.
They are very brilliant, and they're written
Uh-huh.
by somebody with a very deep love of China. I mean, and he was a Chinese scholar. He was a scholar. He knew Chinese very well, and all that. But you tell me all this. It just reminded me that one of these stories is set in a dragon during a dragon
Dragon Boat Festival,
festival,
yeah.
the Dragon
Yeah.
Boat Festival. Yeah,
Yeah.
quite. Gosh.
There's endless stories in Chinese history. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
Well, I mean, absolutely. Well, it's such an extraordinary culture. I mean, I don't know to what extent people in China are aware of the fact, but China is remarkable. And what I get to say is not controversial. Two things. Firstly, it is the only civilization that has a direct line from the Stone Age. Stone Age people evolved into the states that you know in China, all the way to the Chinese civilization of today. So you don't find that anywhere else. There is nowhere else this incredible continuity. And it is by far the oldest state in the world, with a continuous history, going back to what was the dynasty before the Shang, the Xia, is it Xia dynasty? Xia, Shang, Zhou,
Zhou.
Zhou, that's right.
Xia is the first one.
Yeah. But which undoubtedly did exist, and there's some discussion as to where exactly it was located. But anyway, there we go. Gosh.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start with China. There's something very odd. So Biden, not that long ago, conducted this interview with the Time magazine. I think maybe we talked about that. Now, in that interview, the reporter asked him, saying the reporter claimed that the CIA director, William Burns, said that Xi Jinping gave order to attack Taiwan before 2027. Okay, so that's one thing, sometime, maybe 2 weeks ago. But then the past few days, there is an article, I'm sure you read that in Financial Times, that claimed that Xi Jinping said the U.S. Is trying to gold baiting into attacking Taiwan, and China is not going to take the bait, which means China is not going to attack Taiwan, at least not immediately. So there's some contradiction. Now, according to Financial Times, that claim is made to Xi Jinping, to Ursula von der Leyen, of all the people. What is your take on that? What is going on here?
This is extremely strange. This is a very, very strange story. And exactly what is going on is a very good question. I'm not sure I know myself, because you're correct. We're getting completely contradictory accounts now. Some people are saying the Chinese are incredibly aggressive. They want to attack Taiwan. Others are saying that, on the contrary, Xi Jinping is complaining to Ursula von der Leyen that the Americans are trying to goad him into a war over Taiwan. Now, I'm going to give my own thoughts about this. Firstly, I do not believe that Xi Jinping would have said to Ursula von der Leyen, of all people, that regardless of what the United States does, he's not going to let himself and China be goaded into a war over Taiwan. I don't think he would say that to her. And I think that he wouldn't say that for another reason, which is that it basically communicates to Ursula von der Leyen, and by extension to the Americans, that this red line that the Chinese have, and which Xi Jinping has repeatedly said they have over Taiwan seeking independence, that this red line does not exist.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I don't think that Xi Jinping would ever have done that. Now, I think what probably happened, and this is my guess, is that Xi Jinping probably explained, not for the first time, in fact, for the 150,000th time, that China is not seeking war over Taiwan, that the Americans, on the contrary, are creating the situation where such a war would happen, and that the Chinese do not want to be drawn into a war with the United States. And I think she probably reported that to the Americans and to the others and to the British. Financial Times is a British newspaper. And I think that either intentionally or not, maybe somebody misunderstood this and has converted it to mean that Xi Jinping said that China would not be drawn into a war over Taiwan at all. Or possibly somebody took these words of Xi Jinping and has distorted them in order to, again, reassure opinion in the West that these warnings from China are bluff. It's one or the other. I lean more to the first, but it could be the second. But I don't think that Financial Times story is accurate. Not in the way that it records the conversation. As I said, it would be so completely inconsistent with what we know Xi Jinping has been saying to other people that I don't believe that he said, that China will never go to war over Taiwan. That the other thing the article says is that if that they did go to war over Taiwan, then all of the Chinese people's achievements would be at risk. And China's hope for a rejuvenation would be, extinguished. I don't believe he would have said things like that to Ursula von der Leyen. As I said, I cannot imagine that he would, in effect, erase his own red line. I don't believe this.
Yeah, that's what I think too, because then Taiwan would just declare independence, right?
No,
if that's so clear. But I do think Xi Jinping probably at some point, he actually said that in China that to solve the Taiwan problem, we have our own schedule. So we are not following anybody's schedule. Now, when he said that anybody, clearly it's, he refers to the United States and the West. So it could be something like that, he said.
Yeah.
Or also, is it possible that the US and the West think that they get Putin into a war and Putin took the bait, and they kind of like unconsciously feeling that they are trying to do the same thing, but Xi Jinping just doesn't do it. So they themselves explaining that, okay, Xi Jinping figured this out and he's not going to take the bait. Could that be something?
Well, that could be part of the explanation, but again, I don't think that they would have publicized it in quite that way. I mean, to me, it looks like what the Financial Times is trying to convey is that there is no Chinese red line over Taiwan. The red line that we're hearing about isn't real. Most probably, there was a conversation between Xi Jinping and Ursula von der Leyen, who, by the way, is very hostile to China. I think I ought to say that. She takes a very American line on the issue, both of China and Taiwan. But I think he probably explained again, look, China does not seek war over Taiwan. We understand, what a catastrophe such a war would be. Well, I don't know what a catastrophe, but that it would be very bad for China, very bad though for the United States as well. We're not seeking a war, but the actions that the Americans are taking, will ultimately push us into doing something which we would rather not do. And quite plausibly, he did say to Ursula von der Leyen that we're not going to, however, let ourselves be dictated to by the Americans as to when we respond. We will respond in our own way, in our own time. And again, it's entirely possible that a person like Ursula von der Leyen, who, to be frank, is not the most subtle or intelligent of people, might have misunderstood that and might have seen that as basically Xi Jinping sort of pulling back and saying that we're not going to respond at all. I've said this many times, by the way. It's a phrase of mine that goes back about 10 years, which is that you must never bluff Beijing. The Chinese don't bluff themselves. And if you try and bluff them, they will call your bluff. It is the first law of diplomacy, which everybody needs to understand. I don't think people in the West do.
No. Well, talking about bluff, what do you think about this 2027, some kind of a deadline? Now, according to this reporter from the Times, William Burns said that Xi Jinping ordered that. Also, there is another article on the Washington Post. I think the title is called "The U.S. Military Plans a Hellscape to Deter China from Attacking Taiwan." That article got a lot of attention. People talked, social media for a few days. Everybody was talking about that article because he used the word hellscape, right? And in that article, here's what he says. For any U.S. president to send American men and women to defend a small democracy on the other side of the world would be a very tough call. That's why Plan A is to deter Xi from ever attempting an invasion by making sure that he never looks across the Taiwan Strait and sees an easy victory. This is Samuel Paparo, the new head of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, told me in an interview. So that's what's in the article. And then he follows saying they want to offer the world a short, sharp war so that it is fait accompli before the world can get their act together. Paparo told me on the sideline on the annual Shangri-La dialogue, my job is to ensure that between now and 2027 and beyond, the U.S. military and the allies are capable of prevailing. I doubt Xi Jinping put 2027 as a deadline. What do you think?
Well, I think this is a complete piece of imagination. I mean, how would William Burns know? I mean, this is one of the things, I mean, I think that the Chinese government and the Chinese general staff and all of these people keep their secrets to themselves. They're not going to phone up Washington and say to William Burns, of all people, well, we're preparing to attack Taiwan in 2027. So you've got all that time between now and then to prepare. That is absolute, complete nonsense. I mean, it's the kind of fake news story, the kind of disinformation that the Americans spread and peddle all the time. So we could, I think, completely ignore that. I mean, the CIA, which is what we're talking about here, because William Burns is the director of the CIA, is not a reliable source for information of this kind. If that were not obvious by now, then it should be. I mean, this, as I said, this is absolutely no reality to be behind it. Now, I was interested I was hoping you'd ask me about this Hellscape article, because what it actually is, it's such a interesting example of how the Americans behave, because really it's an admission of weakness. It's an admission that the United States cannot commit its military to defend Taiwan, that they can't commit their naval forces to the Taiwan Straits because the Chinese would destroy them, that the political pressures within Washington, within the United States against such a war would be overwhelming. So what do? They do what they always do. They don't back down. They don't draw the obvious and logical political conclusions from this. They reach for a propaganda solution to that problem, which is that they spread this story about all this army, this fleet and army of drones, sea drones and ship drones and all those things, and how they're going to aim for a short war as opposed to a long war and defeat the Chinese in this fashion. Well, I mean, I'm not a military person, but I can instantly see the problems with this. Firstly, in any kind of drone warfare, China by definition has the advantage because it makes far more drones than the United States does. It's far more familiar with this kind of technology. The Russians have now been using drone technology in Ukraine on a huge scale, and they're going to be sharing all of that with China. And ultimately, China has vastly greater industrial capacity than the United States does. I read an article somewhere, which, by the way, I think even understates things, that China's manufacturing industry is twice as big as America's. I think it's more than that myself, actually. So in any conflict where you're using robots and machines to fight instead of people, you're actually going to find that the Chinese have the advantage, especially in area close to their coast. And the idea that the Chinese, of all people, cannot come up with a solution to this is a ridiculous one. What this tells us about all this talk is that the Americans, the American Navy, understand deep down that they can't win a war against China close to Taiwan, that they cannot sustain, and the United States cannot sustain a long war against China, both for political and for military technical reasons. And thirdly, that they have no real solution to it except to come up with science fiction ideas, which the Chinese are going to obviously be able to find responses to. This is a political problem that the Americans have created for themselves.
Mhm.
The answer to it is a political one. You speak to China, you say, absolutely, we not only respect the one China policy, which is what we agreed to way back in the 1970s, and we had all those communiques at that time.
Mhm.
But what we've been doing up to now, we are not going to continue to do. We're not going to send troops to Taiwan. We're not going to supply Taiwan with weapons. We're
Arms,
not
yeah.
going to do all of these things. We are going to try and find some kind of political solution with you to avoid a war. Now, if they did that, the world would be safer. The United States would be in a better position. Taiwan, the people of Taiwan, who obviously don't need to be thrown into the middle of a war, would be safer as well, and the world would breathe more easily. But of course, they can't do that. So they try to bluff China. Remember what I just said? Never bluff China. They try to bluff China with fantastic stories about fleets and drones.
Yeah, in that article, I think somewhere also mentioned that he said that there is a shortage of fund. So I wonder whether there's also that purpose as well. That always is the purpose. They always want more money. What he's saying is that even though the U.S. Military budget is way bigger than the next 10 country combined, but Asia Pacific, where he is mainly focused, he thinks that's not enough. So the whole budget is big, but he wants his part to increase. So there must be some part of that too, right? He wants more money. Okay.
Of course he does. Of course he does. This is what it's always all about. And it's always about money, ultimately. More and more and more of it. There is never enough. Well, however much money you spend, you will always need more. I mean, first of all, there is a logical fallacy at the basis of this, because if the United States takes on unlimited commitments in every place, then it's going to need unlimited money. By definition. So, and that, as we know, does not exist. So, your budget, your military budget will never be enough if you are going to fight everyone everywhere. That's obvious. But of course, the very nature of the American procurement system means that the more money you spend, the more money you're going to need, because we've seen this with Ukraine. The United States needs, also says, to increase its production of 155 millimeter shells. So what's happened? It's throwing money at the problem. And yes, it's getting a few more shells, but at much higher cost, because very much higher cost per shell. The cost per shell is inflating faster than the number of shells are, because that's what happens if your production capacities don't match the resources, the financial resources you throw at them. United States cannot match China in drone production.
No, but they're very good at bluffing. The other example is Stoltenberg. I think he's bluffing. I hope he stopped bluffing. He told the British Telegraph, right? He said that NATO members were consulting about deploying more nuclear weapons, taking them out of storage and placing them on standby in the face of growing threat from Russia and China. So that's what he said. Do you think he's bluffing?
Yes, he's almost certainly bluffing. I mean, again, there's a good article about this in Asia Times by Stephen Bryan, who's a former Pentagon official, by the way. And he's pointed out again that the number of tactical nuclear weapons that the United States has is a fraction of what the Russians have in Europe. And, that's not even taking into account the Chinese. It would be an absolute catastrophe for the United States, for Europe especially, to get into a situation where tactical nuclear weapons are used. And again, Stephen Bryan also pointed out that even if they did try and roll out these weapons, the actual means to deploy them are very limited. And certainly they are against China. It's, again, an attempt to counter Russian warnings by making their own warnings. But of course, the Russians aren't deceived, and the Chinese certainly aren't. poker is an American game, as we know, and
Mm.
bluff is an important part of poker. But the Chinese don't play it. The Chinese don't play poker in their diplomacy. That is not what they do. This is a country with millennia of statecraft behind it. It could see through this kind of thing.
Poker, I think, is very Western game. I mean, if you look at the people's the
Absolutely.
games people play, also can tell you something about the people, right? In China, people play Go and Mahjong, right? None of them require you to bluff. I mean,
No.
really,
Well, Go, which is, by the way, a Chinese game. Just saying,
Yeah.
it originated there. I mean, I know a bit about the history of Go, and I've tried to play it. It's the most intellectual and in some ways challenging game of all. It is incredibly. I mean, the degree of intellectual power that you need to play it successfully, it's much greater than chess. Just saying.
Yeah.
So I mean, but I mean, that is, you're absolutely right. I mean, poker is very, very much an American game. It's based on bluff, and of course, bluff is a type of deception. It's a thing also to understand, and it can work in a situation where the other side can't read your cards. But in this situation, of course, the Chinese can. They know how many drones America can produce. They see the budget figures in the United States. They're perfectly well aware of the constraints on US industry. And they know how many tactical nuclear weapons are. I suspect the Chinese are much better informed about these things than many people in Washington are.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think many people in Washington, they're not that curious, even about themselves, even about the US. They're not very curious about what really is going on, the nuance on international affairs, what's going on, between Russia and Ukraine and the China issue. I bet a lot of them don't know anything, nuanced.
You're absolutely correct. They don't. And they're not interested to find out. And that's the trouble.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the BRICS. So this news that Saudi won't, we talked about Saudi last time, that Saudi joined Enbridge. But at the same time, also there's this news floating saying that Saudi won't renew the petrodollar contract. But then lots of people pointed out that there is no contract. You can't really find this contract. So what is your take on that? Is there, I assume there is a contract somewhere. And supposedly the date is June 9th that expires, and Saudi hasn't signed a new contract with the United States. So that is some people saying, okay, that's not true. What is there? What is going on there?
Right. Somebody is spreading this story, and I've come to a very clear conclusion as to who it is, and it is the Saudis themselves. The Saudis are going out and are spreading this story that there is this contract. Now, what happened was back in the 70s, there was an agreement that happened immediately after the oil crisis of 1973, whereby the Saudis would give the dollar a backstop by pricing all oil sales in dollars, and in return, the United States would allow the Saudis to invest 50% of the proceeds in US securities. So that was the deal that was done there. And I don't know to what extent it was ever formalized in an actual document, but it has sort of stuck since then. And probably there are documents and agreements which have passed between the US Commerce and Treasury departments and the Saudis since then, which we have never actually seen. Now, what happened, I think, is that last year, Saudi Arabia made two decisions. Firstly, that they would accept payment for oil in yuan. They said that. I remember them saying this last year. And the second is they took the decision to join the BRICS. And that signaled that they already had made a decision to start diversifying out of the dollar. So they've been under some pressure from the Americans in recent months. They've given the Americans something on a few things on arms sales and all of that, but they've balanced that by circulating this story that they've now formally pulled out of this agreement. I'm not sure that if there's an agreement that they can formally pull out of. And as I said, the decision was clearly made last year.
Mhm.
But one way or another, if you actually go through where all of these comments are coming from, you see that they are originating with the Saudis. There was an advisor to the Saudi oil ministry who actually discussed it on Sputnik, for example, and spoke about it as if it was true. So the Saudis themselves are telling everybody that the petrodollar arrangement is dead. And that's an important fact.
Mhm. Well, okay. In the meantime, Russia also stopped all the euro and dollar trade, right, in their stock market, or more than that, I think. And then ASEAN country, not that long ago, they also had agreement, which doesn't get report much, that they use their own currencies. Okay, countries using their own currencies instead of using dollar. And also more and more countries in Africa, they also want the US and the French out. Will you think the US would just stand by and watching all these happening? What will they do?
I think the US is absolutely bewildered by what is going on. I think things are happening at a speed and in a way that they simply didn't expect. And I think that they're still trying to work out how to respond to all of this. Now, this step that the Russians have just taken arose from an American decision to sanction the Moscow Stock Exchange.
Mhm.
Now, Russia was unusual in that I should say the Russian financial community is very small. I mean, it's not to compare with the one that you will find in big financial centers like Shanghai, for example. I mean, I've seen it. It's just a few buildings and a small number of traders. They used one trading desk basically to try to exchange rubles into dollars and euros. Now that trading desk is sanctioned. So they're just going to have to do it somewhere, some other way, which in other countries, there isn't just one trading desk to do that. But in Moscow, there was. So they will probably, to the extent that they find themselves holding dollars or euros, still be able to convert them into rubles and back.
Mhm.
It's just that they won't be able to do it through the Moscow exchange any longer.
Okay.
But the bigger story is that other countries are now increasingly transferring away from the dollar.
Mhm.
And the reason is the sanctions.
Yeah.
The United States is going sanctions mad. Much bigger story, in my opinion, than the story that the Moscow exchange was being sanctioned.
Mhm.
Is that the United States has announced that it's now going to apply secondary sanctions against any financial institution, or at least reserves the right to impose secondary sanctions against any financial institution that undertakes any dealings with any commercial or economic entity in Russia whatsoever. The grounds being that Russia now is a war economy, so that any economic dealings with the Russians in any form at all assist the war economy and therefore Russia's aggression, as they like to say, against Ukraine. Now, that means that any bank that has any dealings with a Russian corporate entity, and it might not be direct dealings. That's the other thing. I mean, they might be providing funding to a company, one of whose suppliers also has some kind of contract, going down the road with the Russians. Any financial entity could now find itself being sanctioned. And of course, if you actually read the Treasury announcement, it's quite obvious whose banks they're gunning for. It's China's first and foremost. And so they're now giving themselves the right to sanction Chinese banks without, by the way, needing an executive order from the president. because these are going to be secondary sanctions. So that's already astonishing. But countries in Asia, ASEAN countries, have to trade with China. China is their main trading partner. They can't just have a situation where they're not able to conduct trade with China. And so that, of course, decisions like this incentivize countries to leave the dollar system behind them because they want to be able to continue trade and to, pay the Chinese for the things they buy and receive money from China for the things they sell and to do all of these things. So it accelerates the process. And I don't think the Americans know quite how to respond. And I think that, it's the famous thing that, you try and hold water by tightening your grip. And of course, the water just spills out because that's what's going to happen here. You can't control this process. But what does America do? Does it go to war with everybody, try to force people not to buy and sell things with China or Russia or whichever? No, of course they can't. So they sanction everybody instead, which accelerates the drift away from the dollar, which we already see happening.
And the one thing I also noticed that many times they don't even have evidence to sanction someone. Like Huawei, they claim Huawei had, when they kidnapped Meng Wanzhou, the reason they used is that the Huawei was doing business with Iran. Iran should be sanctioned. But I didn't see they presented anything compelling that there was evidence of that, but they still did that. So they just kind of like, not only they say, okay, we're going to secondary sanction, they basically saying, I think you did this, I think you did that, then I can sanction you, isn't it?
Oh, that's exactly correct. That's exactly what they do. I mean, they act as judge and jury in their own cause. They say, you're guilty. You come along and you say, well, what's the evidence? And they say, well, no, I'm not going to provide you with the evidence. I have the evidence, and I'm making the decision. So go away. I'll just go ahead and do whatever I want because, and you're not entitled to look at the evidence. As for providing a defense, well, I'm not interested in whatever defense you have because I already know. I mean, it's that kind of crazy circular reasoning that is being applied here. And of course, it's disastrous and it's completely wrong. It just goes back to the point, though, that sanctions are a totally arbitrary instrument, an instrument of power. They are detached from any legal concepts. I mean, they're completely unmoored from any question. I mean, when you're talking about evidence, you're talking about a legal concept. Sanctions have no legal concept, legal theory behind them. The Constitution of the United States does not entitle the United States to impose sanctions, nor, by the way, important to say, do any of the treaties that underpin the European Union, nor does international law. International law specifies that only one agency has the right to impose sanctions, which is the Security Council, exercising its rights under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. No other agency does. So, talking about evidence is to treat this as a legal process, when of course it is not. It's a pure assertion of power.
Yeah, talking about power, G7, G7 first had a meeting. I don't see what they really get anything out of G7. And then shortly after that, everybody from G7 went to the peace conference, except Biden. He didn't go to the peace conference. Kamala Harris did. But even Kamala Harris just stayed there one day, I think, the first day, and then he left. I think more than just her, but other people left too. And so the peace conference, I thought it was really very disappointing. It must be very disappointing for Zelensky, right? So what is your overall assessment for both the G7 and the peace conference? What is going on there?
Right, the G7 meeting was terrible. It was an absolutely terrible meeting. It didn't address any of the problems that the West actually has. It published a communique which was horrible about Russia. Well, we would expect that. But was even worse about China, it mentioned China 28 times, and it blamed China for everything. If there's problems, in the industrial system in the West, if the West isn't producing enough solar panels, if there's, shortages of this or excesses of that, if the West is losing in Ukraine, whatever, it's China's fault. It was awful. It was an absolutely terrible document. And it showed such a degree of hostility. All right, to Russia, we've come to accept it, but to China as well, which is so completely unmerited as well, that it was awful. And it was all done with barely any debate and discussion at all. One gets the sense that President Biden is no longer capable of participating in discussions in any material way. And then, as you absolutely rightly say, they all go from Italy. They take the helicopters and jets and fly to the next country north, which is Switzerland. And then they attend the summit meeting. And of course, the summit meeting is supposed to be a peace summit, except, of course, that it isn't a peace summit. And they come up with this incredibly complicated final statement, which you have to read it to see how complicated and involved it is. But basically, it's a kind of trick. It was a kind of trick to get most of the world to condemn Russia and to side with the West against Russia in this conflict, so that they could present some kind of ultimatum against Russia. And of course, what happened was that outside the West, everybody saw through it. So China stayed away, which is absolutely right to do. India and a couple of other countries decided to send representatives, but they refused to sign the final communique. Brazil sent an observer only, who also refused to sign the final communique. There are 193 states in the United Nations. Invitations were sent to 160. According to the organizers, 92 countries attended. According to the organizers, 80 countries signed the communique. I checked the communique. I found that out of those, actually there were 82 signatures, originally 82 signatures. 3 of those signatures were from the European Union, by which I mean by European institutions. So the European Council, the European Parliament, and the European Commission each separately signed this communique. The Patriarch of Constantinople, who's an Orthodox priest and is not a state, he also signed it. So did the Council, the Council of Europe, which is another body that is part of the European community. Various countries, 3 countries that were supposed to have signed, Iraq, Jordan, and Rwanda, actually didn't do so and have complained about the fact that they were listed as signatories when they were not. Countries that are listed as signing this communique included countries like Kosovo, I believe Taiwan. I'm not absolutely sure about that, but I think it's there. I mean, yeah, in other words, phony countries, Andorra. Ultimately, only 76 states signed it out of 193. The states in question are all of those that are aligned with the West. And it was an absolute disaster. And as I pointed out in a recent program, one which, by the way, YouTube didn't like and has tried to suppress, compare the 76 countries, predominantly pro-Western countries, that signed this communique with the 141 countries that at the General Assembly of the United Nations condemned Russia for its so-called invasion of Ukraine on the 2nd of March 2022, when this went before the General Assembly. And you could see how between March 2022 and now, support for the Western position over Ukraine has completely collapsed. Most of the world is walking away.
do you think there's a fatigue, Ukraine or Zelensky fatigue, even amongst the Europeans and Americans, leaders?
I think there is, though they would be very, very nervous about admitting it. I mean, if you read the speeches of the European leaders, which, by the way, I did, well, I listened to some of them. I mean, they were terrible. I mean, they looked like, or they sounded like they'd all been written by the same script writer. Some of the same turns of phrase were appearing. We must remember that in this war there is a victim and there is an aggressor. The victim is Ukraine, the aggressor is Russia. This was repeated time and time again by leader after leader after leader. It was utterly robotic sounding. But I think that behind all of that, there is fatigue. Certainly there is fatigue amongst the European public. I mean, the European Parliament elections made that completely clear. But of course, there's now some countries that are starting to openly express doubts. It's not just, countries like Hungary and Slovakia and Serbia and Turkey that are criticizing the policy. We're starting to see the Italian government becoming increasingly more critical, the Spanish government as well. Governments are starting to say, well, look, we can't continue like this. We have to have negotiations. These have to be serious negotiations. They must involve the Russians. But for the moment, the NATO bloc is just about holding together, even as its positions erode internationally around the world. I think this conference in Switzerland, by the way, will have created further worry and further doubt amongst the more intelligent leaders. They will have seen the extent to which support is just drifting away.
One thing that I was reading checking the Chinese media. So it seems like there's some more information coming out of explaining Lihui's visit. So he visited Ukraine twice, right? He visited, Lihui is the envoy, right? China envoy to
I know he is, yeah.
Yeah. And he visited last May into Ukraine and didn't achieve anything. Apparently, now they're different in details, different commentators talking about, but it seems like what he went there, the purpose was that Russia seems like willing to entertain the idea that those regions, in particular those 4 regions that Ukraine used to belong to Ukraine and now Russia took over. Now Russia willing to entertain the idea that those 4 regions Ukraine can somehow still claim to be Ukraine's, but even more independence, using, however you want to play with the words, as a starting negotiating point, meaning Russia is willing to give some kind of a diplomatic cover for the Ukrainian government as a starting point for negotiation. Now, of course, Zelensky rejected that. So not only that, he in June, they launched a counteroffensive, which didn't go very well, of course. And so in November, Putin announced that those regions would participate in Russian presidential election, which is a clear sign that those regions are part of Russia. And then again, March this year, Lihui visited Ukraine again, and we talked about that he was mistreated there. They didn't show much respect to him at all, which again, apparently also Lihui brought this idea again with him. I guess Russia agreed to, was some kind of a diplomatic cover for Ukraine. For the time being, not clearly declare all these territories that Russia took are Russians as a starting point to negotiation for the time being, okay. And then again, of course, it's got rejected. And then Putin, I think later this year, Putin also, I think not that long ago, demanded a complete withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from those territories. So I guess when Russia took it over, they didn't just ask all the Ukrainian troops to leave. They somehow coexisted there. I guess for the reason is that kind of like use that as a way to give some diplomatic cover for Ukraine. But they all got rejected. It seems like that's what the Lihui was doing. Well, what's your take on that? I mean, if that's the case, I actually think Russian is actually giving a pretty big concession for negotiating. Okay, Russia hasn't said we're going to go ahead to do that, but as they kind of like open to those ideas. What do you think?
The Chinese reports are absolutely correct, and we can say that with confidence. If you check out what Putin said a couple of days ago, last week, at the board of the Russian Foreign Ministry, because he set out there what the conditions were for negotiations. And he said that the conditions for negotiations were these. Firstly, Ukraine had to commit that it would not join NATO. That is an absolute Russian red line that is not negotiable. The Russians have repeated this time and again. It goes all the way back to 2008 and before. It's the big Russian red line. But on the 4 regions, he said this. He didn't say that Ukraine must recognize that these 4 regions are part of Russia. He said that Ukraine must withdraw its troops from the 4 regions. Now, that is a completely different thing. And he said if Ukraine withdraws its troops from the 4 regions, then Russia will negotiate. That is what he said. So he's not making Ukrainian acceptance of Russian sovereignty over the 4 regions a condition for negotiations, which takes us back to the point that the Chinese media are making, and which Lihui is trying to explain to the Ukrainians. What the Russians are saying, withdraw the troops. You've got to withdraw the troops. But we are prepared to talk about everything else. I mean, the Russians do regard these 4 regions as Russian, but they're not asking Ukraine to accept that. Of course, the point may come when that changes.
Well, don't you think that's a pretty big concession, diplomatically giving Ukraine a way out, kind of like, isn't it?
It is a concession.
Yeah.
I mean, it does exactly what you say. It opens up an opportunity for negotiations. It says, look, we understand that you can't accept this. This is our position. We understand you can't accept it. Withdraw your troops and we can sit down and talk, and we can have a ceasefire as well, by the way, provided you also agree that you're not joining NATO, and then we can move on. But, of course, Ukraine won't do that. They insist on keeping their troops there. They insist on fighting. They're insisting that Russian troops must withdraw to the positions they occupied on the 1st of January 2014. And that's not going to happen. Everybody can see this. So the Ukrainians insist on maximalist positions, which, of course, leave no room for negotiations at all. The Russians are not doing that. They're taking much more moderate stance, prepared to negotiate. But of course, the Ukrainians are not listening.
They just keep on, miss out to opportunities, right? For them, there are plenty of China, Turkey, right? I mean, there are plenty of countries trying to help, but they always just believe somehow they have to join NATO, right? Isn't that what it's always come down to?
Yes, I think this is true. I think the fundamental problem, and it goes back to both Western policy, which basically refuses to negotiate or discuss the question of NATO membership with any third country, however dangerous it might be, to that country. The Western powers take this absolutist, maximalist position on that question, which, by the way, has no legal basis. Just saying. But the Ukrainians also, and this you have to go back to the what I call the Maidan movement, the movement that gained power in Ukraine in February 2014. And that is that it never agrees to concessions. It sets out maximalist positions. It always has done. It expects to get the total support of the West, which it always does. and it believes that if it holds out long enough, then the other side will just crumble and give it what it wants. So the Ukrainians never negotiate. They didn't do that over the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement also provided them with a way out. The Minsk agreement would have returned Donbass to Ukraine, but they weren't prepared to do that because they weren't prepared to grant even the most limited level of autonomy to the regions in Donbass. So this is the trouble. You have to deal with people who don't negotiate at all. They never have done, never at any point since the political movement that they represent emerged in Ukrainian politics about 20 years ago.
Yeah. And then in the meantime, they just keep on fighting, right? And
they keep on
dying.
fighting, and they keep on fighting, and they keep on losing, and more people die, and more of Ukraine is lost. But temperamentally, viscerally, they can't change their outlook on this. And you see, one of the other problems is that because they've had the support of the United States, and because they have, to a certain extent, won previously, they did take power in 2014. They did reshape the character of Ukraine, the part of Ukraine that they controlled, in the way that they wanted to afterwards. They did ban all the parties that opposed them. They have got into the habit of thinking that if they are intransigent enough and refuse to negotiate, sooner or later things will turn out the way they want. Of course, that can only happen if they have the unqualified backing of the West, and that can only happen if the West itself is as strong as they imagine it to be. If neither of the last two are true, then of course they're into the game of playing fair, holding out for all or nothing, in which case if you don't get all, you can end up getting nothing.
Yeah, and I think Biden actually is sending a clear message. He didn't even go to the peace conference. I mean, and Kamala just was there one day. I mean, how much more clear message do you get that they're not that into you? I mean, you see what I mean?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, the Americans, I think at some level are getting going back to your earlier question, are getting very tired of Ukraine. It's now well established. We've got articles about this in the Financial Times, that the Americans are getting very frustrated with Zelensky himself. Of course, they're blaming Zelensky, but Zelensky's just, an example of this mindset amongst Ukrainians in general. just saying. So, but I mean, there was a long article in the Financial Times which was talking about paranoia and delusions from the Ukrainians and all of this, and the Ukrainians making always endless demands for help and insisting that they be given absolutely everything, that America prioritize them in front of everything else. This colossal sense of entitlement that the Ukrainians have. And, the Americans are getting frustrated and exasperated by this. But yes, they don't turn up to the conference. I mean, Biden didn't go. Kamala left as soon as she could. But so far, they haven't found the courage or the wisdom, perhaps more than courage, to simply say to the Ukrainians, enough. We can't go on like this. You can't go on and expect everything from us. You've got to compromise. And I don't think the Americans will ever do that because, of course, when we talk about the Americans, they're not united over this issue amongst themselves. There are people within the US who support Ukraine in its pursuit of its maximalist objectives, not because they care about Ukraine, because they don't, but because they hate Russia and they hate China as well. And they think that if they defeat Russia in Ukraine, well, that will be a catastrophe for Russia and it will be a disaster for China too. So you have that problem.
Yeah, they just refuse to look at the facts on the ground and to study. Another crazy person is Natayahoo. So he dissolved his war cabinet. What does that mean? even I read that it means that he's whoever is left, they are going to be even more hardline. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's completely correct. I mean, the war cabinet was created after the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October. So that created a sort of coming together within Israeli society, and it meant that opposition parties, which are somewhere to the left politically of Netanyahu and his government, and who perhaps take more liberal or more moderate policies than Netanyahu does, that they joined the war cabinet. But they were opposition parties. Now they've left the war cabinet, and what's left is the original, very, very hardline government that Netanyahu had before the 7th of October, which still has a majority in the Israeli parliament, and which is still therefore in control, and which is now free to pursue even more aggressive policies than it did before.
And towards many countries, I mean, towards more than just Hamas, right? I mean, Lebanon, there seems like getting more and more real fights going on there. And then recently there's some news in China that people are discuss, which is Egypt has sent a lot of valuable artifacts to China, to Shanghai, to participate in some kind of exhibit. But they sent like 700-800 of those artifacts, some of them huge and really valuable, things. So there are people in China, social media speculating, saying, is Egypt prepared for a real war with Israel now? That's why they moved all these things to China.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. I mean, I didn't know that, but I can only tell you what Alistair Crook, the former British diplomat who knows this region well, has just been there, I believe, and he says that the Egyptians are openly talking about the fact that war with Israel is now on the horizon. So that, and he didn't mention this when I discussed this with him. He didn't mention this incident with all these treasures that have been sent by Egypt to China. So maybe that this is a real fear now. You see, the thing is, it's exactly the same problem as the one we've just discussed with Ukraine. You have hardliners in Israel who have been getting more and more hardline, more extremely hardline all the time, who have been pursuing maximalist objectives for Israel ever since the state of Israel was founded. Just as you have a political movement in Ukraine that never compromises on its most extreme objectives, so you have the same thing in Israel, a political force that never ever compromises on anything of substance. And in both cases, they've both been encouraged to do that because they've had unconditional support from the United States. And in both cases, rather than compromise, they are prepared to escalate to the most extreme levels. And in Israel's case, you have a political movement that leads a country that, thanks to the Americans, has nuclear weapons. So it is very dangerous. And which is, rather than compromising, even as they're losing in Gaza, they say, well, we're losing in Gaza, so what can we do? We're going to make the war even wider. We're going to involve even more players, because that way, perhaps we can get the Americans to come in and save us.
In a way, it's almost predictable, right? That because where can he go? Where can Netanyahu go? I mean, it seems like it's clear he won't stop. So if he doesn't stop, the only way is to just extend it, escalate it, right? He can't stay where he is either, right?
Yes.
And
this is absolutely. I mean, absolutely correct about Netanyahu. I mean, both Netanyahu and Zelensky also have a personal factor here. Neither will remain in power if there is compromise and peace. So that, personally, putting aside their personal feelings, their private feelings, this also incentivizes them to take the most extreme positions. So you're quite right. He has no choice. He has to press on, because if he did change his position completely, I'm not saying he even wants to, but if he did, he would very quickly be out of power, and he would quite probably be in prison. So, of course, he's taking the most extreme line. By the way, the Americans get into this mess all the time. They give unqualified support for all sorts of dangerous people who then won't negotiate or compromise at all, and who lead the United States down a blind alley. You saw that, by the way, in China, when the Americans gave complete, unqualified support to Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang. They were Mao and Zhou Enlai met the Americans. They said to them, "Look, we're not against you. We want the good relationship with you. Why are you supporting this terrible man and these terrible people?" The Americans wouldn't listen. They knew how corrupt Chiang Kai-shek was. They knew how incompetent he was, but they knew that he would never negotiate and never compromise. He didn't even compromise after the Xi'an incident. You know the one I'm talking about, when he was captured in 1937 by some of his own generals who wanted him to negotiate. They knew the personality of the man, and yet they still backed him. And the result was total military disaster. They did the same with Vietnam. They're doing the same with Israel. They're doing the same with Afghanistan. You remember, President Ghani, he wouldn't negotiate either. They're doing the same in Ukraine. They always get into this mess, and they every time that it goes wrong, it gets worse for them.
And also, do you think people like Zelensky, like Netanyahu? I mean, if you look at Taiwan, the DPP, right, the ruling party, I find that their whole existence, the DPP's whole existence, is laid on the ground that they want independence from China. It seems like if they don't have that topic to talk about, they have nothing. They have nothing to offer. They simply don't know how to improve, like economy, for example. It's so much easier just to create an enemy, that's the mainland China. The same thing, I think, with Marcos Jr. He's a little bit like that too, right? He kind of like, I don't think he has an idea how to really run the country and how to improve the economy, etc. Instead, just create China, the monster, enemy. It seems like the easy way out. Is that what is these people, how they're functioning?
Absolutely, of course it is. Exactly. I mean, if we're talking about the Taiwan independence movement, I have to say it is exactly the same. I mean, I listen to their comments. I listen to the way they talk. I listen to their anger and their hate of China. It reminds me immediately of the Maidan movement in Ukraine. They are exactly the same. And you're completely right. If they didn't have that, they would have nothing. The Maidan movement has governed disastrously in Ukraine. It's the poorest and most corrupt country in Europe. Taiwan, it was built up over decades with the help of China, by the way, just saying. I mean, if China hadn't traded with it, it would just be an offshore island. It wouldn't have progressed. But, they are not really interested in all of that. Fundamentally, their only policy, their only objective is secession and hostility to China. You saw this in this terrible speech that the new president made to the soldiers in Taiwan, which is a terrible speech. And again, the Americans back this. They always end up backing people like this.
And there are plenty of these people, seems like, incompetent, right? And yet ambitious in a way that they like to be in charge. They like the idea to be the so-called leader, but they don't really know how to lead, right?
Well, there are, to answer your question, of course there are, absolutely. But of course, the other thing is that they also believe, and I think this is the thing that links all of these people together, they have this absolutely unquestioning faith in the unlimited power of the United States. Mm-hmm. The Ukrainians definitely have it. That's why they get so angry when the Americans don't give them everything they want, because they assume that this is because the Americans have made some kind of choice. They don't understand that there are limits to what the Americans can do. And you're going to find that with the Taiwanese independence movement as well. They believe that American power is limitless, and all they have to do is surf on it, and they will achieve not just independence, but power, fame, riches, all of those things, because they're choosing the winning side. And of course, when it turns out otherwise, it'll be too late for them.
Yeah, in China, there's saying that if you put your hope on other people, it's not hope to start with. So
well, that's why China is the world's longest state, longest existing state, because it has always presumably followed that doctrine.
yeah. I want to talk something a little bit almost like insanely funny. King Charles, he has his new insignia is delayed, so they're still using Elizabeth insignia because they canceled the order from China. They're suspicious that these, I guess, royal badge will have China will put GPS in there. Is this some kind of a joke? Is this true?
It's absolutely true. This is, I don't know whether you can see it, but this is the English pound coin. You can see that it still has the Queen's head on.
Okay.
Not the King's. It's absolutely true. They've cancelled it. They haven't been able to do anything.
Because they're afraid of the GPS? China put GPS in there?
Absolutely. The Chinese are all over the place. They're in the mint. They're in absolutely everything. They can control everything. They can distort everything. I mean, it's comical and absurd. It is absolutely comical and completely absurd. It also shows the level to which political debate in Britain has declined. They're now producing a couple of stamps, by the way, with the King's head on them. But, the Royal Mail is about to collapse anyway, so I suppose that's not too much of a problem. Everything else, we can't let the Chinese get themselves involved in any of that. The story is absolutely true.
It's onion. I thought it was some kind of onion story.
No, it's not. It's not an onion story at all. It's been in the media here.
So, and also I read that there's some self-media people are claiming that in London, he lives in London, it really is bad in terms of the economy and also like just a lot of theft going on. Is that true? Just very common. People getting robbed and things get stolen.
This is absolutely true. Now, I've lived in London continuously since 1968. It's my hometown, and the level of deterioration is just incredible, and it's been particularly rapid in the last 10 years, and it's become even more rapid in the last 3. I mean, the place is full of rubbish, uncollected rubbish. The roads are full of potholes. The pavements aren't surfaced properly. You see graffiti everywhere. You see homeless people in many places now. People living on the streets. It's not quite San Francisco. If what I've heard about San Francisco is true, it's not quite as bad as that. But the deterioration is very, very rapid, and there's an awful lot of knife crime. I mean, London used to be a very safe city. It was one of the safest cities in the world. There's lots of knife crime. Now, burglaries, thefts are very, very widespread, especially thefts from cars. And there are lots of thefts of cars. Now, just to say, my wife and I have 3 little children, and we also have 2 big dogs. So we needed to buy a big car. And the car that we were looking at, because it is stolen so often, it can't be insured. The insurance companies will not provide insurance cover for it because the probability of it being stolen if it's parked in London is so high. Wow. So that gives, that's something that we experienced ourselves. So things are very bad. They're very, very bad indeed. But don't worry about that. look for solutions for it. Concentrate on China instead. They're the real threat. They're the real problem. And, publish a communique, the G7 communique, in which you blame China for absolutely everything. Including the fact that, you're losing in Ukraine or that the climate is changing. It's all China's fault.
Well, the London problem, is that the city level problem, or is the British government level, you think?
I think it's both. Ultimately, I think there's a general sense of, first of all, it's not just confined to London. You find it in many cities now. I mean, the smaller towns, especially in the richer areas, because they're small and they're more wealthy and all that, things are better administered there. But in the big cities, in London, Manchester, Newcastle, Sheffield, the problems are pretty much the same. One major problem, very difficult for people in China, I think, to understand, is the debt levels, government debt levels, debt of central government, debt of local government is now so high, and interest payments are so high, is that there isn't enough money to pay people to straighten the flagstones, fill the holes in the road, sweep up the rubbish, arrest the prisoners, make sure there's enough police around. So there is that problem, which is gradually eating away at the fabric of Britain. And by the way, I think Britain has an extreme case of this, but you're finding this in many European countries also. I was in Germany. I'm going back to Germany soon, by the way. I should just tell you about that at the end of the program. But when I was last in Germany, I was astonished at the evidence of decay that I was seeing. The railway system in Germany has all but collapsed. There is now graffiti on the streets in Germany, such as you never used to see. It's not quite the efficient and tidy place that it was. And then we also traveled to Austria quite recently, and we were amazed to see how dirty and untidy Vienna had become for things of this kind. So it's Britain, as I said, is an extreme example, but you find evidence of it everywhere because the European economies are not in very good shape. They're in much worse shape than they want to admit to.
By the way, Habeck, I thought I read somewhere he's going to visit China. I believe that will be his first visit to China. He's going to bring some delegations. Yeah. We can watch on that one for the coming week. But what's your take initially? What you think he wants to do there? He wasn't very friendly to China.
He isn't friendly at all. But I think he understands that he's partied the Green Party in the European elections. Its vote collapsed by about 40%. I mean, its popularity is draining away, and Germany needs to maintain trade links with China. And the only way that the green transition can happen is if Europe works with China. But of course, the forces that work against that are very, very strong. They've just imposed these disastrous tariffs on Chinese EV cars. We've discussed this in previous programs. By the way, there was a very interesting article in the Daily Telegraph by an economic commentator called Matthew Lin, who made exactly the point that you and I were making, that what they're doing, the Europeans, by imposing these tariffs, is that they are creating the conditions for the eventual collapse of Europe's car industry. But there we go. But, he's coming to China. It's too late. He should have come to China back in 2021 when there were the elections and the new government in Germany was formed. In other words, when he became economics minister, it should have been obvious that Germany's economic minister should visit. One of the first countries she should have visited was Germany's biggest trade partner.
But these are ideologue. The same thing with Annalena Baerbock. She's also, she even said something like she doesn't want to, live in a planet where China is. I mean, where does she go? Because China is not going anywhere, right? As a diplomat, how can you say something like that? But these people just very ideologue, right? Driven. They're not practical at all.
Well, they're not practical at all, and they are. I have to say, I mean, they're unintelligent. They were all there, by the way. We were talking about the Swiss conference. They were all there at the Swiss conference. They were saying the same, saying this, talking in the same way, being incredibly rude and boorish about everybody who was, and that's one of the reasons why the world is drifting away. Why more and more countries want to join the BRICS? Thailand and Vietnam now, apparently.
Yeah.
Malaysia too, I've heard.
Yeah, I think maybe next time we should talk a little bit more BRICS. Yeah, there's a lot of things happening there. Many countries are interested. But in general, it's still, I believe, it's still a economic bloc, right? It's not going to be military. Definitely
no. I definitely think not, and I think I don't think it will ever become that, because I think that they understand very well that if it does start to develop in that kind of way, it will collapse. It's basically about keeping trade moving, despite the problems that the Americans and their allies are trying to cause. That, I think, is what the BRICS ultimately is all about now.
And they will never sanction anybody. I think that's pretty clear to me.
Well, both China and Russia take the position, which is the correct legal position, by the way. Ask many jurists, they will tell you as much, that the sanctions are illegal, that there is no provision that enables the United States and Europe to impose the sanctions that they do. So they will never sanction anybody. The only entity that has the power to engage in sanctions, to impose sanctions, is the Security Council of the United Nations. And that does so very rarely and very infrequently. And for only one purpose, which is to preserve peace. That's the only purpose it does it for. Not, because it disagrees, ethical standards or values or anything of that kind. So China and Russia will never impose sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, they shouldn't. I really don't think it. Because sanction only hurt people. It doesn't really, it's not working. It's, country will not cave because you sanction them. It's only hurting the people. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, with that, I think another great session. Thank you so much.
Great session. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Have a great time.
Good to see you. Bye.